Luke Vargas has joined us from around the world in recent years. He is United Nations Bureau Chief for Talk Media News, and today he joins me from Hanoi, Vietnam, where he has been traveling through Vietnam and the Philippines investigating the South China Sea dispute. So let's start, Luke, at the top level. For people who don't know about the dispute, tell us about it. Tell us about the Chinese land reclamation in the South China Sea and what's going on.
Right. What we're basically talking about here is China engaged in the later stages of a multi-year sprint in which the country has basically set foot on as much territory within the South China Sea as it can. And it's all of this is contained within what China calls its nine-dash line, a historically rooted claim of most of this ocean. It's a brazen land grab by all terms of the word. It violates territorial claims of Malaysia, the Philippines, Brunei, Taiwan, Vietnam. And we should care, I think, about this for three reasons. The first is economics. About half of global maritime trade passes through the South China Sea, and if that were to be interrupted, the consequences globally would be tremendous. The second reason I think we should care about this issue is for purposes of international law, still in their infancy in many dimensions, are really being contested here. There is some clarity to how territorial disputes should be handled in the high seas, but we need cooperation, and we should be arbitrating these disputes instead of settling them by force or through economic threats, both of which China is doing. And finally, we should care because the stakes are really high. The U.S. and many other countries have civilian ships, planes, and military personnel in the South China Sea. If you think it's easy to run afoul of the Turkish-Syrian border or Iranian waters in the Persian Gulf, you should see how complicated the competing claims are in the South China Sea. And with tensions high, accidents can turn in.
Let's start with Vietnam. You were in Vietnam for the 12th Party Congress. And I hope Luke can hear me, Lewis. I mean, I just don't know. We're having a bit of a connection issue. Vietnam selected new leaders. Vietnam is still a communist country. Many people may not know that. What was the Party Congress like that you observed, and who did they elect?
It's a fascinating political landscape here. This is a communist country. It looks a little different than Russia, for example. It's more colorful, but in many ways, it's still very communist. It's a country that blends nearly total state control of certain key industries, but one that also allows in foreign capital on its terms. Sort of a very different situation than what we were taught in school, which was that economic liberalization would bring about the end of these sorts of old political systems. In fact, foreign capital here helps support the ruling Communist Party. Well, what we saw this week was 1,500 delegates from the Communist Party of Vietnam come here to Hanoi. They select the head of their party. This is not a democratic system. There's no say for the people in this country about who their leaders are going to be. And what you've seen is the re-election of the general secretary. His name's Nguyen Phu Trong, and it's not a terribly important name for most people to remember. The important thing, I think, is that they are staying the course. This country has decided the strategy it wants to pursue, and when a country can work in 5-year blocks, you can actually accomplish a lot. It's much unlike the United States system, where your agenda is undermined as soon as you're in office. So the mandate continues, and Nguyen Phu Trong is going to be able to try 5 more years of the strategy domestically and in foreign policy that he's pursued over the last 5 years.
So, how is Vietnam handling the South China Sea dispute, and is that similar or different to what's happening in the Philippines?
Well, Vietnam says it knows China best. It has fought China 17 times through its history. And Vietnam's strategy is that the way to deal with this is to play power politics, that China does not respect the rule of law. So you've got to sort of bend your strategy to fit in more with theirs. There have been attempts in this country to beef up the military. That's been expensive. It hasn't really led to much. It's been an action by some accounts. So the main strategy here has been to leverage economic ties. It's a country that is pursuing free trade deals. It is a country that signed on with incredible excitement to the Trans-Pacific Partnership. to ASEAN, the sort of economic and political community of Southeast Asia. The hope here is that these 21st century economic ties that Vietnam can forge might be able to offer the sort of protection that 20th century alliances used to promise. They hope that money talks. The Philippines, on the other hand, is not playing power politics. It's trying to be the good guy on the international stage. It's doing two things. It's creating formal partnerships with the United States, telling it to come to its bases, and even paying for U.S. soldiers to transit around the Philippines in the hopes that having the U.S. right there on the doorstep of the South China Sea would cause us to step in if anything goes wrong. And the other thing the Philippines is doing, different strategy here, it's something that's sort of a strategy sort of laughed at here in Vietnam, is the Philippines is basically trying to take China to international court, appealing to the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, some of its arbitration courts, saying Chinese territorial claims are invalid, and they're seeking these sort of consultancy rulings from these courts. Again, in the Philippines, they think this is too slow of a strategy and one that allows China to get away with too much for too long. So the strategies are very different.
Is it fair to say that, or can we say that one strategy, either the Vietnamese or the Filipino strategy, is working better, or is that not clear at this point?
I think it really remains to be seen. I'll say, one big thing here is that a country like Vietnam, with no free press, with politicians all sort of falling into line behind the party many times, at least in their public statements, might be a little bit safer for Vietnam's strategy, because both the Vietnam and the Philippines have major trade imbalances with China. So if you have politicians bad-mouthing the big player in the region, that could cause some sort of disruption in trade, which would be very detrimental. So in that regard, I think Vietnam might be able to contain itself, to prevent itself from saying anything that ends up hurting it in the long run. The Philippines strategy is very untested. International law here, and a lot of scholars will say, has promise, but it is so untested. And on top of that, China has already claimed these lands. It has already begun dredging. It has already, as we saw earlier this month, begun to land planes on these 10,000-foot runways that it's built out of the sea. So in many ways, hoping for a multi-decade sort of lawsuit here is certainly not going to undo any of the work that China has done, taking these territories. And so perhaps a strategy based on long-term economic growth at home, but also more economic integration overseas so that more countries protect Vietnam's interests. I think that strategy might win out in the long run.
Where is the U.S. in this entire thing? I mean, in terms of strategy and position, where is the U.S.? And is there anything in all of this that might get the U.S. involved militarily?
The U.S. is doing a little bit of both. So on the Vietnamese side, you have John Kerry coming. It's not Vietnam, but he was in neighboring Laos. Kerry was in Laos earlier this week. He's going to come back twice more this year. President Obama is coming. And this is a strong attempt by the administration to say, hey, we support ASEAN. We support the community of Southeast Asian countries. And the U.S. is encouraging these countries to negotiate with China as a group. It doesn't want China to be successful in its strategy that it's demanding that countries negotiate with it one-on-one. The fear being that China could peel off countries to sort of toss them a bone and to get them to settle their grievances so that it's left with a smaller and smaller roster to negotiate with. On the other hand, the U.S. is doing what the Philippines would want. It's doing these the U.S. is doing these military patrols within the 12 nautical mile claimed exclusive area of these Chinese fake islands, and trying to go on the record, probably for some sort of long-term arbitration, saying in 2014 we didn't recognize your claims, in 2015 we didn't do them. So in many ways, the U.S. is playing both sides. And as far as getting sucked into any sort of military agreement, the legal scholars I've talked to say there isn't much risk here. This is these agreements that the U.S. has with the Philippines and others have wiggle room for us to get out if we really need to. We could say, hey, we never really said we thought these islands were completely yours. We sort of just intimated that. And on the other hand, for Vietnam, the U.S. has a lot of agreements which have wiggle room for human rights. It's a great fear of Vietnam that if they are really sort of doomsday approaches for them and their territorial integrity is at stake, the U.S. could say, hey, well, but you don't have a free country and we're not going to come and help you out. So the U.S. is playing both sides of this, waiting, I think, to see how the courts react and how the military and economic situations shape up. But the U.S., I think, could get out of an arrangement before we're in the middle of World War III with China over the South China Sea.
All right, Luke Vargas joining us from Hanoi, Vietnam. Very late at night there right now. Luke is, of course, the United Nations Bureau Chief for Talk Media News. Luke, always great to talk to you, and I will see you in New Hampshire on primary day.
Yes, you will. Take care.